So when we go ahead and get ready to paint, the next thing we're going to talk about is supplies. Now, really, there's only a couple that you need. It can be intimidating, but it's really not that big of a deal. So obviously, paper towels are going to be fundamental. So grab a couple paper towels, have some on hand. You are going to need a glass jar with a lid that closes tightly. You want to be able to tighten this because we're going to be putting some of the turpentine, or terpenoid in this case, into the jar, and it is toxic, and it's airborne. So we want to work in a well-ventilated area. You're going to notice I'm over here by the windows, and I'm going to actually have these windows cracked so that I have some airflow. We're not breathing in toxic fumes. I want to be able to pour some terpenoid into this jar and then close it fully so that then those fumes don't escape. I'm going to grab a little bit of this linseed oil. Linseed oil is a nice thinning media, and the media can carry and give you better flow without sacrificing the quality of the paint. We'll need a little bit of the terpenoid. I do keep this stored securely, so you'll need to ask me for any of these supplies. These are not things you just have access to. You'll need some nice synthetic brushes. These brushes have good synthetic bristles. That way we can get a nice even flow. I'm grabbing a couple oil paint tubes, and then I've got one of these big butcher blocks. These butcher trays are a nice sort of ceramic, and that way they're easy to clean off later when we store our paint. It also is a way that we can then saran wrap them so our paint does not get dry. Then I have my canvas and my source image, but that's really all you need supply wise. So before I even start oil painting, the first thing I want to do is sort of prep my canvas. And I went ahead and I got a little canvas board, but you could do stretch canvas or gessoed canvas, anything you like. What you're going to notice is I decided I want to use a grid so that my proportions are really, really accurate in this so that I get the actual likeness of the person. So I went ahead and I gridded my photo, sort of set that up ahead of time. And now I've gridded this. Now you can draw directly onto a canvas board or a canvas with pencil, with colored pencil, with anything you like. But sometimes, since I'm going to work with subsequent glazes of oil paint and I want that kind of luminosity to shine through, I don't want a big line trapped under the paint. So I actually stretched thread, and I want to show you how I did this. So on the back, I measured my grid ahead of time, 1 inch by 1 inch squares. And then you can see that when I go in, I just taped some thread across, stretching it across my canvas board so that now, you know, when I paint, I can paint directly over this grid. And these might get a little paint, but they'll move a little bit as well. But since they're taped on both sides, they'll stay relatively in place enough that when I block out my initial canvas, it should be in good shape. Now you might wonder, hey, why are some of these rectangles, why are they squares? I just got lazy. I didn't want to do 1, 2, 3, it saved me a couple, because really I only need the 1 by 1 inch squares kind of here. These other areas, it's less important, so I got a little less detailed with my grid, but that can be a good way to start. And then next we'll talk about supplies. All right, so here's the part where I'm excited to get you guys going. So if I look at my paint, I squeezed out a little bit of the oil paint, but what you're gonna notice is in some areas, I can actually get that a little bit thinner, and that is our linseed oil doing the work. So the linseed oil, that is a thinning agent that will thin out your oil paint just a little bit and give it this nice sort of, I don't know, transparency almost, just so it can behave a little bit more like a watercolor. So now what I can do is I can go up in here and I can just start to go ahead, and you'll see it's gonna spread really, really nicely. I can just go right in and I can paint directly on top of my grid. They'll bounce around a little bit, but they'll snap back because I taped them on the back. But notice how nice and thin this kind of goes. This wash can be really, really helpful. And I'm just using my brush to kind of like get this nice thin base coat. Now, this is a little bit different. Now, some people, you can do an underpainting in oil, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm gonna pick up a little bit more of my paint. But what you'll notice with an underpainting, now so here I have a little less oil, but with an underpainting, you know, with oils, you got more dry time, and it doesn't just like, you know, let it dry for 1 hour and then go over it like acrylic and then cut, you know, kind of cover over. You know, that base coat can take a little while, and that can be an issue. So I'm gonna go in, and as I keep picking up paint, and I've added a little bit of linseed oil to my palette so that then it's nice and thin, I'm gonna go in and I can just kind of paint in this. Now you'll notice sometimes it leaves a little bit of a line, so then I can just kind of go under it. But eventually it always snaps back. But I'm going in and I am using the oil and using the paint color to kind of create almost a lightest version. So if I look at my source image, you know, I'm not gonna have any whites anywhere, even my highlights, and I can always put those in later, but I kind of want the lightest unifying, it might be right in there, but even that, there's a tone to that. So I'm creating sort of this base layer of tonality in my canvas, so that then when I paint, I can just start to build that up. And I'm actually gonna paint my initial underpainting. I'm gonna do that monochromatically using this glaze color, so that then that's kind of like almost like a black and white version, but just in a one hue. But yeah, I've got this nice, it's coming along nicely, it's getting started. And I gotta be careful, you know, I can't be totally rough because sometimes I can move my grid a little bit, but it'll give me enough that I can work with it. But that's what I'm gonna do for my underpainting. And it's gonna create this nice sort of ethereal layer, which then I can gradually build my layers of paint up. But that's how I get it started. And then we'll talk about cleanup a little bit later. All right, so we've jumped ahead a bit. So I've primed my canvas, you can see, and I did my base coat in the last little stretch. And now what I've been going in is I've been using the same color that I did as kind of my base coat, which I think is gonna be the lightest value. And I found it really helpful to print out my photo in grayscale. Obviously I got a lot of work to do to fix all these proportions up. There's some things I can see right off the bat that need amended. But what I'm basically doing is a very light sort of foundational sketch where I'm going in. Now, sometimes I can take my paint and I can use some of the oil or get a touch of the linseed oil, although honestly, a lot of the time I just can pick it up right here from the palette, and then there's a little bit of, you know, sort of give still to what I've done. So if I look, I can actually wipe away the paint still that I laid down yesterday, because the oil is gonna make this a much slower dry. And I like that because that makes it still workable. If I go in and need to make amendments tomorrow or days away, I have that. So I'm going in now and I'm just kind of looking for values and trying to match up my grid pretty well and at least get the main thing. So, you know, if I see main shadows on the face, I'm trying to replicate some of those values over here. Same thing with the cat, etc. So now I've kind of worked my way down into this area where I can kind of sort of, you know, copy the paws and whatnot. I'm just kind of copying this line and going in. Now I didn't grid it perfectly. I can see that my proportions are off, so I need to shove stuff over and revise my line. But that's the nice thing about there being a little bit of oil on my palette, or actually on my canvas, is as I'm painting, if I kind of keep working at it, it's actually kind of thinning my paint out as I go and allowing me to kind of like revise and spread. And then I can kind of, you know, just sort of like taper it and fade it into, it's almost like a dry brush, but the oil is gonna sort of work its way in and allow it to sort of spread and maneuver. And that's how I get more of this like soft, almost like I'm shading it with a pencil. You know, I'm going in and it's very much like when I shade with a pencil. You know, if I'm gonna do kind of this shadow over here and I pick my spot, you know, I can go there on there and I'm just kind of like, I can start to sort of build that value and shade it in. Again, I can go right across my string lines. Now I'll get rid of those pretty soon because they're kind of bothering me, and I'm at the point now where I feel free enough that I don't have to worry about them, so I can get rid of them. But yeah, I'm just going in and I'm starting to bring out these details and try to match the values to what I'm seeing on the page. And I want to get this baseline done. So I want to sort of get this foundational sketch done, and then I can start adding other values and other hues over top of it. Okay, so where I left off was the sort of sketch where I did it monochromatically. I had done my sort of foundational in that peachy tone, and then I used that same tone, the peach, to sort of sketch out a monochromatic sketch almost of the values and lay out the main proportions and shapes of my painting. And now you can see on this one, I've started to drop some color in. Now I'm doing this in kind of a blocky way. So if you look at the gray on the sleeve or even the tones on the cat, you know, as I'm going and some of my natural values start to arise, there's some areas of light and dark. I have a little bit of shading on it, but not a ton. It's pretty flat. And I'm really just trying to drop in the major color tones that I see in my work. So I've got a gray sleeve with a little bit of shadow work. I've got the cat with a little bit of the striping on it, but not nearly as much as I'll do later. So I wanted to block this in. Now, as I move on to the next piece, here you can see now I started to do that even more. So the hair's got some orangeness to it, and I've even put some values on the face, more values on the cat. I'm just starting to develop pink and, you know, sort of pink on this pillow where I need to be. I'll do the wall eventually, but I'm starting to drop in more and more sort of blocks of color for sort of the major areas of color. So I don't need a ton of it, but I definitely want to make sure that sort of the large shapes have been delineated on the composition so that then later I can go in and rework each area with shadow, with highlight, and different tones inside. So what I'm going to do next is just keep layering. So I've kind of blocked out the face. It's a little too pale, obviously. So, you know, one thing I can do is I can warm that up. I'm, again, a big proponent, and not everyone oil paints this way. There is some freedom in how you want to do this, but I'm a big fan of using a little bit of linseed oil to thin out a color. And then I can go in and I can start to like do these kind of like almost thin glazes over top that just kind of like warm up or cool down whatever I need to do without drastically changing the value, because that's the one thing I don't want to do. And I'm not a big believer in adding white. I can take a little paper towel. It's a little too much in places. And I can pull that away. You know, I can pull some of that pigment away to lighten it up, because again, I want my lights to almost sort of just emanate from underneath rather than just like mixing up a milky white that just feels kind of gray and milky and bleh, and dropping it on. So I can kind of just do this thin glaze to warm up the face a little bit. It's really subtle, but it's just a little bit. And then I can go in and same thing. I can start to look, where do I need to just sort of like warm this up a little bit? How can I do that? Oh, we're going to talk about connect time. All right, so I'm just kind of glazing this in.
Teachers and students, just a quick reminder, if you checked your email, we will have our spooky fun.
All right, I'm going to keep going, and we'll pick up and let you see where this is.
Please treat yourself.
So I'm dropping this kind of rosy tone that I mixed up, and I'm really just looking for, where am I putting this in? But it's, again, because it's thin, it's adding value without totally obscuring what I've done before, because I don't want to just like get rid of all that. I worked hard to get those tones and get those values right. But at the same time, I want to be really accurate, especially if I'm on a face, right? I don't want to inadvertently create a form that's inaccurate. All right, well, that's gonna do it for now. But yeah, we're just gonna keep working. All right, so I've skipped a couple steps, but now I'm starting to go in and I'm just really working up my values
and seeing where I can start to bring those darker values in. To create a little bit more development. And because what I've laid on already has a little bit of the linseed oil in it, my colors are gonna kind of just inherently blend, which is nice. But I can see, okay, where do I need to drop my values, especially if I'm looking at, you know, my source image. I'm like, okay, I see all this dark in here. And as I've kind of developed everything, I also want to be careful not to wear the paint away with my knuckles. So, you know, I can get in there, and I'm just kind of going in and starting to bring those darker values, and I can blend them. That's the beauty of oil. I can kind of blend them in with what already exists and kind of integrate them a little bit more smoothly, a little bit more effectively. I'm just kind of pulling that in. It also means that sometimes I have to be aware that not everything just feels milky and blurs together, you know? Sometimes we can overblend, and we have to be very sensitive to that. But getting these darker values in there is allowing me to kind of, you know, just sort of work my way up, which is, you know, really I love it because it's very similar in a lot of ways to if I were shading, you know, even with graphite, you know, as we sort of gradually take our pencils and build our surfaces up. So, you know, it's a nice correspondence with that. And as the values start to develop, I'm gradually just going in bit by bit, and I'm getting more form and development that way, based off my image. And I'm still gonna go in, I have quite a bit I still need to do. But as I start to pull those darker values in and integrate them, suddenly I get a lot more dimensionality. So I finished those kind of darker, not fully dark values, but deeper values. But you can see where there's some areas, especially on the cat, where it's still pretty undefined. And now I can go ahead, and then if I skip forward a little bit, you can see where I go and I start to add even more detail to that. I really am starting to work on some deep, almost black tones. Again, I mix my blacks myself. And these glazes, it's really about just pushing each value slowly deeper and deeper and deeper. But that's going to start to really unify the piece when I have some of those deeper values embedded in the piece. So then we get to sort of the final piece. I rendered it as much as I need to. I wanted the cat to feel furry without feeling over-rendered. I wanted there to be a softness. But then when you get in some of those deep values, almost black, that's really what then gives this the sense of form that it needed to really make the face, the hair, those shadows, really make everything have that dimensionality that we were looking for. But I'm pretty pleased with this. So again, the main idea behind this way of oil painting is you're really just building up so gradually, layer by layer by layer. Rather than painting one object and moving on, you're working the whole thing from start to finish, from a place of light to a place of dark. And that's going to give it this almost luminescent quality is my goal, or this sort of soft focus. Not that there's not definition. There's some really clear definition in some areas. But when you're kind of putting in these glazes or almost this like shading with the paint, rather than just applying thick strokes, you can get something that feels pretty luminescent, and it's going to dry pretty quickly. So that if you are hoping to work in an area and you painted it yesterday, it might be slightly workable, but it's not going to be wet. Whereas if you have big, thick globs of paint, it's going to take a long time. You're going to be struggling with managing all that wet paint. But I'm happy with this final product, and I hope this was helpful.